Greetings and welcome to the Quincy Institute's conversation with House Armed Services Committee ranking member Adam Smith on a new approach to America's role in the world. My name is Trita Parsi. I'm the Executive Vice President of the Quincy Institute, a transpartisan think tank in Washington, D.C. that seeks to move U.S. foreign policy away from endless war and toward rigorous diplomacy. We favor a national security strategy that is centered on diplomacy and military restraint. President Joe Biden promised a foreign policy for the middle class. He pulled the United States out of Afghanistan and promised an end to regime change wars. For a while, it looked as if Biden was even flirting with the idea of pulling the US away from hegemonic approaches that had led to these endless wars and major spikes in military interventions. But competition with China, Russia's unlawful invasion of Ukraine, pushed Biden's foreign policy back toward a more conventional approach at a time when the American public clearly was moving towards being quite tired of wars and foreign interventions. Our conversation today with Congressman Smith will reflect on the past 4 years of the foreign policy of the Democratic Party and assess the utility and effectiveness of America's current grand strategy. Does the United States need to dominate the world militarily? Democratic Party deal with Trump's foreign policy if it moves towards constructive diplomacy with actors such as North Korea, Russia, Iran? And how can members of both parties in this hyper-partisan environment still find ways to work together for a better foreign policy? Few members of Congress are better positioned than Adam Smith to reflect on these questions. As the former chairman of the House Armed Services Committee and its current ranking member, he has long been at the forefront of the Democratic Party's foreign policy debates and decisions. Smith has served in the House of Representatives since 1996, currently representing Washington's 9th Congressional District. He created and now co-chairs the Congressional Caucus for Effective Foreign Assistance, and he attended the University of Washington Law School and is known as one of Congress's most independent thinkers on foreign policy. For those of you who are joining us via Zoom, you can use the Q&A function to ask your questions throughout the conversation. If you're watching this on Facebook, on Twitter, or on any other platform, you can put your questions in the comment section and we'll try to get to those as well. So with no further ado, let's get started. Congressman, thank you so much for joining us. This is an important and timely conversation, and we are delighted and honored to have you with us.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you. Two organizing principles of the Biden administration's foreign policy was the so-called democracy versus autocracy theme, as well as America's leadership in the so-called rules-based international order. Biden pursued a rather military aid-heavy and diplomacy-light approach towards Ukraine, armed and funded Israel's destruction of Gaza despite much international and domestic critique, and put almost all of his Middle East eggs in the basket of the idea of a normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia, which never materialized. On China, Biden largely continued the policies of the Trump 1 administration. You had a front row seat to the intersection between foreign policy and defense as the chair of HASC at the time. How would you grade the last 4 years of foreign policy of the Democratic Party? Where were the wins? And in retrospect, what would you have done differently?
Yeah, I wouldn't grade it to begin with. I would rather get into the specifics of where we need to go. I mean, if you're grading it and trying to pick wins and losses, I mean that's more backward looking instead of forward looking in terms of what we need to do. I think you should start with the principle of where you want to be, what you want to do, and then plug that into the lessons that have been learned. So I just sort of invert that slightly. And look, one central piece of this conversation for me is this is a work in progress. I am developing ideas, learning from what happened, learning from other people to figure out where we need to go from here. And to do that, we definitely, I think one central principle, we are not where we need to be in terms of having a left side of the political spectrum foreign policy. We're not. What we're doing is not very popular with just about anybody. We seem to be caught in between a variety of different thoughts. So big thing number one, we need a reset. We need to say, look, we got to get to a different place. Second, within that reset, Donald Trump's president and he's moving, he's acting. So we could have that reset sort of independent of whether or not Donald Trump was doing anything. But we also need to do it within the context of what he's doing. Understand what is an intelligent and effective critique of his foreign policy, and not just reflectively oppose everything that he's doing. It needs to fit within a context that is different than I'm going to support Democrats and I'm going to oppose Republicans. That's not helpful in terms of understanding where we're at. And then specifically from the left side of the political spectrum, we need to balance sort of two things. On the one hand, and I think Quincy has done a good job of pointing out the limitations of what has been traditional democratic foreign policy that has relied too much on the principle that the U.S. needs to be dominant in the world, number one, and number two, selling ourselves as this benign, benevolent force in the world that is for all things good and great, fighting even. Both of those things have pushed us into corners of setting impossible to meet expectations and created problems, and we have been too reluctant to engage in diplomacy. I think all of that is true. But we got to balance that against its two things that I think folks on the left struggle with. Number one, as Americans, we need to let people know that we fundamentally believe in America as a positive force in the world, and not just sort of in a going forward perspective that, well, of course, America can be good, but we've been awful before. No, we need to recognize not just what America has done wrong over the last 80 to 100 years, but also what we've done right and why that matters, why what we did coming out of World War II, why, at least promoting to some extent the concepts of greater democracy and freedom, rebuilding Europe after World War II, rebuilding Japan, even to some extent fighting for South Korea in the North Korean War. I mean, North Korea is a real problem right now. It would be a bigger problem if they had all of Korea. We have done things like USAID and foreign aid. So we need to show that we understand that the U.S. has done some positive things in the back, and we believe in a positive concept for the U.S., number one. And number two, understand that we do have adversaries in the world. And those adversaries don't just exist in reaction to our bad behavior. A lot of times when I speak to people on the left side of the political spectrum, that's always the perspective, that the only reason that we have a problem with Iran or North Korea or Russia or China or anybody is, well, they're just reacting to our bad actions. And some of that certainly is true. They too are trying to protect their interests. I think we need to be open-minded about that. But some of it is because they're doing bad things in the world. And they are, in fact, threatening us, threatening regions, and we need to have an adequate deterrence to that. So that's the balance. There's a whole bunch of different other pieces here in terms of what Trump is doing, but I want to let you, get into the Q&A on how we get there. But that's how I think we need to begin thinking about resetting what would be sort of a left side of the political spectrum foreign policy going forward.
No, I think that's really excellent. And I think you're quite right. Obviously, there's been a tremendous amount of good done as well. But there's also been quite a lot of problematic things, not just from us, but from many other actors as well. The examples you gave, incidentally, seem to be really focused on the pre-end of the Cold War period. What would be the best examples in your view if you were looking at it post-1992 of the positives?
Yeah, I think we've really struggled since then, to be honest. And I think the more important thing is I don't know that there are a ton of positives other than the fact, well, I mean, I think maintaining the basic alliances that we always had. Look, I think pushing Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait and making sure that he didn't take over Saudi Arabia was a pretty big positive. I think also, I personally, and I know this is controversial because where Russia is concerned, I think what we've done with Eastern Europe post-Cold War has been really positive. If you look at the Baltics, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Romania, you look at what those countries are now compared with what they were under the Soviet Union, and we have countries that are much more democratic, much more prosperous. Estonia was the second poorest country in the Northern Hemisphere under the Soviet Union. Now I've been there a couple of times, very prosperous, successful society. A large part of that is because they integrated into the rest of Europe, Western Europe's approach and the American approach. And we were a huge part of that. Letting them into the EU. Yes, letting them into NATO to give them a security umbrella. I mean, you can't look at Eastern Europe and not see that the approach that we've generally taken was clearly superior to the approach that Russia took when they were directly in charge of that part of the world. So I think there have been positives. Where we've really fallen down is in this sole remaining superpower nonsense. is in this idea that, oh gosh, now that we've conquered the end of history, right? Now, liberal democracy is going to reign supreme and the US can simply move the pieces around on the chessboard at will. To the degree that we've created that impression in the rest of the world, it's not good because we don't have that level of power. And then we think that we should, so we try to exercise it. And I think Libya is one of the best examples. And I know there are many out there probably listening on this call who have a darker vision of why we went into Libya. But let's just be a little bit, I don't know, positive about that for the moment and say that we saw what Gaddafi was doing. We thought it was wrong. We envisioned a better future for Libya, and we knew that only our military might could help with that. So we dove in to try to, I don't know, try to make Libya more like Estonia, if you will. And that was, to say that was naive is a massive understatement. To think that we could just show up and fix Libya, or even Afghanistan, and I'll close on Afghanistan. I say this frequently, and there's a lot of people who argue with me, but for different reasons. But the reason we failed in Afghanistan, in my opinion, is because we took on a task that no one could have succeeded in. All right. That's it. Now you can argue, well, we put too many eggs in the Karzai basket. We worked with, too many warlords who were problematic. It was too corrupt. We didn't look. The notion that the US and our allies were going to show up and create some sort of effective government in Afghanistan and provide a security umbrella, it was a task that was never going to be successful. And I think that arrogance, that belief that the US can fix anything in the world has really gotten us into trouble.
So I have to say a lot of this is truly music to my ears, because I think recognizing that dominating the world, as you put it, is not something we can do. It's not ended up well for us or for others. And the belief that we can go in and fix everything should also be discarded, as you suggested, because it would lead to a situation in which we wouldn't have thought that we can do that type of a nation building in societies that we really have a very poor understanding of. Within that context, what would you do with something that actually has come from the left, which is the idea of dividing the world between democracies and autocracies? Do you see that as a useful frame, or do you see it as a frame that also can lend itself towards us actually getting into forms of great power competition, unnecessary confrontations, mindful of the fact that the world at the end of the day is not as simplistic as simply being democracies and autocracies?
No, I do not think that is a useful frame. It is not a useful frame at all. Democracy is not an on-off switch. I think that's the fundamental misunderstanding, which frankly is something that we struggle with here at home in the US. The notion that the more people have a say in more things, the better off we are, isn't necessarily true. I believe that people should have a voice in how they are governed. I don't believe that everyone should have a say in, I don't know, where the freeway gets built or whatever. It's just, so too much democracy can be a problem. I think a better frame on the global front, actually, I'm a huge fan of the Millennium Challenge Corporation, which was set up during the Bush administration. And that was the notion where we're going to go in, we're going to sign compacts and work with countries to develop good governance. I think the concept that you want a rules-based system, you want people to have freedom, prosperity, and justice. And there's a whole bunch of different component pieces to that. Having, a decent law enforcement system. Certainly you need security, but you also need an effective education system. You need to make sure that women and girls have equal access to education and job opportunities. You need to make sure that you have a good healthcare system. All of the things that go into building a strong society, it's not just, oh, you have a democracy, you're great. No, we need to look at it in a broader concept. How can we work with the rest of the world to help countries deal with the very real problems that every country faces, whether they're an autocracy or a democracy? An obsession with elections certainly got us into trouble in Gaza. I mean, we held this election, Hamas won, or in Egypt, we held an election and the Muslim Brotherhood won. All right, well, what do you do then? Okay, so I think we need to have a broader concept on two things. One, it's not just democracy or autocracy. You try to move towards better governance and better outcomes and better equality for more people. And there's a bunch of different ways to get there. And two, less what I'm saying here makes your audience think that I'm advocating that the US go in and do this everywhere. No, we should be part of that. We certainly have experience. We have resources. We have allies and partners who I think can contribute to helping countries in that context. But we shouldn't be the ones pulling the strings. We should be part of the effort. And I do think it is worth it to draw a contrast between the US and our partners and allies and Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. Now, you don't just say it's democracy versus autocracy, but it's decent governance and decent rule of law versus oppression and just brutality. I can easily look at what Putin has done with Russia. And just for example, what the countries that broke away from the Soviet Union did, and they're not perfect. I understand that. But you look at Poland, Romania, the Baltics, the countries that have broken away, they're much freer, much more prosperous, much better run societies than what Russia is doing. And even, and China is very oppressive in the way they approach things. Iran obviously has been hideous for the Iranian people. The Iranian government has been. So I think we do have something to offer that is better than what those other countries do. But dumbing it down to democracy is better than autocracy, we win. I don't think it's true, A, and B, I damn sure know that much of the rest of the world no longer buys that. So we need to come up with a better, more sophisticated approach.
And one of the things that you said is that, the foreign policy of the Democratic Party has not necessarily been a political winner. And I do wonder why things have shifted in a particular direction. Some people want to see a very radical shift, but if you take a look at some of the things that have happened, the Democratic Party has not really spoken about diplomacy in the same way as before. Many people are worried that it's become too hawkish and too skeptical of diplomacy, which has then allowed the other party to claim the title of being the party of peace, while Democrats at times have tried to out-hawk the GOP rather than reclaim the position as the party that actually promoted diplomacy, opposed stupid wars, celebrated multilateralism. And just taking a couple of examples from just the last year, Kamala Harris spoke about having the most lethal military in the world, while Trump was talking about that he wants to see the killing end. Celebrating and campaigning with Liz Cheney, Congresswoman Slotkin was elected to give the response to Trump's State of the Union. And one of the things that she said in her speech was that she was really lifting up Reagan as the Cold Warrior, the good Cold Warrior with moral clarity, which, we can have many different opinions on it. In many ways, perhaps is quite fine, but chose to focus on that instead of, for instance, lifting up the diplomacy that Obama did with Cuba or with Iran, et cetera, that actually had tremendous yield for America. Why is it that the party has shifted in this direction? If you agree that that actually is a representing shift and not just cherry picking, and how can it shift back in your view?
I believe three things about that. Number one, I think you're right. I think there is no question that is a problem. Number two, I think a large part of the reason that we do that is because we are reacting to the perception of our weakness. If you grew up through the Reagan era, this was one of the big advantages that Republicans typically had over Democrats, is that Reagan was strong in the face of our adversaries and strong in the face of the Soviet Union and communism. And we were weak. So we feel like not me, but Democrats to some extent feel like if we were to say we're going to negotiate with Russia, the Republicans would jump all over us and say that we were being weak. And, if we were to talk to China, and I think a real problem we have is we feel that lack of credibility. We don't feel like we've got, as Democrats, if you're working on foreign policy and national security, you don't feel like you've got a safe place to go. And look, and I've been advocating for a couple of years now that the Biden administration should have directly talked to Russia. I didn't agree with this, nothing about Ukraine without Ukrainians thing. we're playing a major role here. Now, believe me, I do not agree with shutting off Ukraine and leaving them completely vulnerable the way Trump just did. And we can get into that in more detail in a moment. But yeah, I mean, you remember Barack Obama back in 2008 in that primary debate, someone asked him if he would do, no preconditions conversations. And I forget all who he listed some of our adversaries in the world. And Barack Obama's instinct was, yeah, sure. And everyone, oh my gosh, here they go the Democrats again, giving in to everybody. It's like, talking with somebody doesn't prove that you're weak. It depends on how you talk to them. It depends on, do you get taken advantage of? But engaging, I think there's a perception amongst a lot of Democrats that we're vulnerable on that issue and that Republicans will come after us for looking like we're weak on it. The whole Cuba thing. I mean, my goodness, we've kept up this ridiculous policy towards Cuba that hasn't worked for 65 years, 60 plus years at this point. But we know that the Cubans and other Latin America communities will turn on us. So there go the Democrats again, being sympathetic to a communist. So I think there's a perception of that. And the other part of the problem that we have within the Democratic Party that connects to that is we don't really have support from either side. And this is one of my beefs I have with the left side of the political spectrum is they're always banging on us for not doing one thing or another. And then we do four things, and then it's the fifth thing we didn't do. So my father used to have this expression that between two stools, you sit on the floor. So, on the one hand, we're trying to let the country that perceives us from the Reagan era forward as Democrats being too weak in the face of our adversaries. So we try to do that. On the other hand, the left perceives us as being too willing to buy into neoconservative global dominance visions. So they're going to jump all over us for anything we do in the middle of it. And we wind up with no support from anybody. And that I think is one of the primary challenges we have here on the diplomacy front. But no, I don't disagree with the frame that we sort of walked into that problem. And I think part of what we need to do is, and this is simple to my mind, much more aggressively embrace diplomacy. I think we should have been much louder during the Biden administration. We need to have an arms negotiation discussion with China and Russia. We need to have that conversation. I think we should have put Russia to the test on Ukraine. All this nonsense about how, all Russia cared about was it was Ukraine not being part of NATO. When Putin's out there saying over and over and over again that Ukraine needs to be part of Russia. All right, but let's put them to it. Let's say, okay, if that's all you want, let's go have a negotiation. Being afraid to negotiate, to my mind, is the ultimate sign of weakness. Because it just proves that you think that if I get in a room, you're going to trick me and I'm going to do something stupid. So I completely agree. We need to more aggressively embrace negotiations. But the reason we got into that is pressure from the right and pressure from the left that basically left us with no real support base and constantly sort of, trying to navigate that. And don't get me wrong, I do not believe that the Biden administration navigated that as well as they should have, but those are some of the pressure points that have created some of these problems for Democratic leaders on foreign policy.
And where would you put Biden's Gaza policy in the context of the foreign policy of the Democrats having lost a lot of support? I mean, there's a poll that shows that out of the 19 million Biden voters who voted in 2020 and did not vote in 2024, meaning they didn't vote for Trump, they stayed home. The folks that stayed home, the plurality, 29%, larger than any other group, stayed home because of Gaza. And we can separate from what the policy, good or bad, what it should have been, etc. But in terms of a degree of disconnect with the voters, that was so clearly banging the drums and saying we're not okay with this, and we're not listened to.
Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. The banging the drums part rang a little close to home, but, and let me just say, and we should talk specifically about what to do with the Israeli-Palestinian situation in the Middle East as well. But I think you hit upon a really crucial point. And I think that is very true, that was a problem within a certain chunk of the Democratic coalition. I've always felt it's completely wrong to refer to that as our base. I mean, a base is something that you can count on. And that particular part of the coalition, I can tell you from personal experience, I don't think there's hardly any Democrats out there that can count on it. They have a long list of demands. And if you don't meet one of them, then you're off the island, as it were. And I think part of that is why I want to have this conversation and why I've reached out to Quincy and reached out to others on the left side of the political spectrum. I think we need to rebuild that coalition and get to a realistic place. And I think there are plenty of reasons to be concerned about our policy towards Israel and towards Palestine. But the groups that are advocating for that tend to be the groups that also condemn every aspect of U.S. foreign policy for 80 years. They condemn Western culture in general. They are unwilling to see the benefits of where the U.S. is at. They don't support the right of Israel to exist as a state. They are pushing a one-state solution only in the opposite direction. So I think, and I don't agree with that. As sympathetic as I am to the fact that Israel is not giving a future for the Palestinians and to the devastating cost of the Gaza war, I'm not really willing to buy into the idea that Israel is an illegal settler colonialist country that doesn't have a right to exist, number one. Number two, I'm not willing to buy into the idea that Hamas isn't more than just a bunch of freedom fighters for the Palestinians, that they have a very problematic ideology, as do the Houthis, as does Hezbollah. So it leaves us in a very bad position there, because I'm not going to agree with that rather extreme left way of looking at it. And I think this is what the Biden administration really wrestled with. And they wrestled with it in not a good way. They advocated their policy, but then they didn't look like they were really committed to it. And it was not a good look. And it was because of the deep divides within the broader Democratic coalition on foreign policy and national security. And I think there are legitimate concerns about, like I said, some of that more extreme, America's always wrong about everything. Israel is a state that doesn't have a right to exist. Those are things we don't support and don't agree with. So how do you work with groups in that position to get to a more reasonable policy? And I don't know. That's why I want to have these conversations.
Well, one thing, Congressman, is that the groups and the individuals who were active on that space were extremely, extremely broad, and
Yes.
folks coming from all kinds of different directions. I'm sure there were some groups who held the views that you said, but the actual asks were a ceasefire. The actual ask was uphold American law. If law says that you cannot provide weapons to a unit that has been violating international law and committed war crimes, then those weapons should not be flowing. And we know that the internal investigation of the State Department revealed that indeed those violations were taking place, but the law was ignored. So just as you pointed out, you shouldn't be voted off the island for disagreeing on one or two things. The broader coalition had rather reasonable demands: uphold American law, and make sure that there's a ceasefire. And there wasn't any response from the Biden administration on that issue.
Yeah, well, and let me just say that the Biden administration did not respond as directly as they should. Actually, Brett McGurk wrote something just about a month ago that was the most strident. Here's why we did what we did. Here's what we were dealing with Hamas that I wish they had said at the time. They always sort of looked like they were apologetic about their policies. They didn't stand up for them. I think they should have explained them more clearly. But on the ceasefire question, I don't think it was as straightforward as you said. The ceasefire resolution that Cori Bush introduced a week after October 7th called basically for a unilateral ceasefire. It did not say anything about the hostages or about the release of those hostages. Now, later, the message developed into more, we support a ceasefire with the release of the hostages. But the upfront message right after October 7th was ceasefire. Didn't say anything about the hostages, didn't include. And when I and several others declined to sign on to that bill, my house got vandalized as one thing. Democrats could no longer hold public meetings because they had people showing up and shouting at them and threatening them and intimidating them and shutting them down because we wouldn't agree to basically a unilateral ceasefire on one side. And then that morphed into you support the war and you support genocide and you support all this. And I don't know, I didn't hear a ton of voices in this broad coalition that you described standing up and say, no, that's wrong and that's unfair. That's not what we're advocating for. We're advocating for a ceasefire that I did support once it was put on the table in February that included a discussion of the hostages and of their release. So I think, yes, it was a broad coalition, but what seemed to be driving it was a pretty extreme view that gave limited space to get to a reasonable outcome.
I want to move on, but I do have to point out one thing. Every
Sure.
single resolution that the Biden administration vetoed at the UN Security Council put the release of the hostages on an equal basis, if not even higher, than the ceasefire.
So I was talking
Uh,
about my own world in Congress, and what we were dealing with in terms of the asks that were being made of me. But
yeah,
I hear you on that point.
this is going to be, I think this is one of those things that there's going to need to be a lot of conversations, because in order to be able to build a functioning constituency, as you said, for a better left foreign policy, there has to be a reckoning of exactly what happened there. And many of the points that you made obviously need to be included.
No, and
I
I
wanted to share,
agree.
yeah.
Sorry, it just on that reckoning, it really does get into that core of what is the role of US in the world. And if the core belief here is that there's something illegitimate about the US as a settler colonialist state ourselves, then that's going to inhibit our ability to play a positive role in the world. And I've got a long explanation about the way civilizations have worked from the beginning of time, and the notion of conquering lands and expanding your territory was not invented by white Western United States culture. We need to figure out how to get past that. I'll grant you that. But we got to be sort of intelligent about how the US can play a role in that. Sorry, I know we
And
keep.
there, I have to say, one of the things you're so clear about this, and I think it's so tremendously helpful, pointing out that, the idea that we should be dominating the world is just not feasible. It has many other problems with it,
Agreed.
but it is
Yes.
something that really has pushed us in a very dangerous direction now. So we have 750 bases around the world, which is, the infrastructure of that foreign policy, so to say. And critics argue that this approach is a key reason as to why we have ended up in endless war. If you want to dominate every corner of the world all the time, you will be at war somewhere all the time. And that is going to drain all of the resources of the United States and also create internal problems, because the militarization externally will come home at some point. But what do you see as the best pathway of being able to shift? Because that is a major shift. This is a foreign policy that has now been in place for several decades. How do you untangle America's idea of its leadership in the world from the idea that it needs to dominate militarily in order to be able to have a leadership?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I think we have to be honest and understand how we got here and why we got here and why all of that is set up. It wasn't really set up because we wanted to dominate the world. It was set up, it was born of World War I and World War II. I mean, prior to World War I and even after World War I, there was a general philosophy in US foreign policy that we were going to look after our own stuff, and what was going on in the rest of the world didn't really impact us. Now, obviously, that's not 100% true. We forced our way down into the Panama Canal. The Spanish-American War, caused us to expand some territory. But by and large, we looked at the rest of the world and said, that's your thing, not our thing. It does. We got these two oceans. We're not impacted by it. But World War I and then World War II created a situation where, ignoring those problems, they rose up to the point where they did wind up being our problem, where our ships were getting sunk, both in World War I and World War II, before we were even involved in it, and we got dragged into those wars to fix them. So coming out of World War II, the basic philosophy was we have to stop these things before they start. So we're going to be engaged in the rest of the world. And I think part of what could help with sort of a leftward way of looking at things is to recognize how well that worked, how well that worked for us and how that worked for the rest of the world. Now, if you hold that up against the standard of a perfect respect for human rights, perfect individuality, perfect democracy, perfect freedom, all of that, sure, we didn't do that well. But compared to the entire history of human civilization, no conquering power, and to a certain degree, in the summer of 1945, that's what we were. We were the conquering power. We had just won against all of the other industrialized nations in the world. We didn't choose to enslave all of these people. We rebuilt them in Europe, in Japan, and we tried to build a world that would have more international rules. There's no perfect international rules-based order, but we set up the UN, we set up the International Monetary Fund. There was an effort to come up with a way to do alternative dispute resolution, alternative to trying to kill each other. And it worked pretty well. And part of that principle was, if all of these other countries that used to build up militaries and then go at each other didn't have militaries, if they just focused on economics, like Germany and Japan and Italy and the rest of Europe and elsewhere, then that would be better. Well, are those countries going to be willing to do that if they're concerned about their own security? No. So we will provide that security. And that's the cliche: Germany down, Russia out, US in. Japan, pacifist nation. And they were able to do that. And they built a great economy because we provided their security guarantees. South Korea, I know they're going through a couple of issues right now, but by and large, they moved from a dictatorship to a robust, prosperous democracy because we provided the security for them. And that's a good thing. And that's not a good thing in the sense of US imperialism and conquering. It's a good thing for the world. And I think we need to acknowledge that. Now, the world has shifted and changed a little bit. And we have been dragged into some of those conflicts that you described, A. And B, we got way too ambitious with that principle. Vietnam, was us being way too ambitious with that principle. Libya. Afghanistan. Now, Afghanistan, we did have to deal with because they had attacked us, but that didn't mean that we needed to stay there for 25 years trying to rebuild the place, or 20 years, sorry. So yes, and I think start with, here's why we did it. Here's why the world has changed. It's not 1952 anymore. So it's okay to update our thinking at this point. And we need to look for partnerships and allies in diplomacy. And part of this is, it's simply not possible to have that level of dominance anymore. I mean, in 1948, the United States of America was responsible for 90% of global manufacturing. We utterly dominated the world. We don't anymore. We're not going to be able to. So we're going to have to look for partnerships, alliances, and a little bit more flexibility on the whole democracy autocracy thing in order to build that stable world that we envisioned afterwards. And I think if you make that argument that I just laid it out, it makes perfect sense. And we can get after some of the real problem we have right now of how we have to defeat China. We're not going to defeat China. We're not. All right. China is going to exist. We're going to exist. I had dinner with the Chinese ambassador a month or so ago, and I had this conversation. China also has this vision of late stage capitalism and how the US is inevitably going to collapse. They need to shut the hell up about that too and recognize we're not going anywhere. You're not going anywhere. So we better figure out some way to peacefully coexist. So we need to build a frame for this world. Not a frame for the 1950s, not a frame for the 1990s, a frame for the world as it actually is right now.
And what we're going to get deeper into China as well, because I have several questions on that. But what you just said there about peaceful coexistence, which means that we have left the frame of thinking either we dominate them or they dominate us, but that actually there is a possibility to coexist. And in some ways, perhaps you are reflecting what Marco Rubio said, in which he said, not only is the world multipolar at this stage, the unipolarity was a historical accident and an aberration,
100%.
Meaning that it's not something that we actually even can bring back. And once we internalize that, there's a lot of different things that change. And within that, the Democrats have to a large extent also stopped talking about multilateralism, the UN system, etc. In a world in which we have to coexist with China, they cannot dominate us. They should not. We should not try to do the same thing with them. Where do you see the UN system, the multilateral system, international law fitting in? Because I would assume that in a world when we recognize that our power no longer can constrain other powers in the same way as it could in a unipolar moment, we will need additional instruments. Yeah. Those are alliances, many other things, but also these institutions, international law, in a way that has not really been popular in the United States, particularly not on the right, but to some extent also not sufficiently internalized on the left, because all of that conversation took place in a unipolar moment rather than what we are today.
Yeah, so much to say about that. I'll try to make it concise. I mean, first of all, when you look at the international institutions, I think we need to get past this idea that there's some perfect set of rules that we can put in place that now we're going to judge everyone and we're going to figure out what's right and what's wrong. That's just not the way the world is going to work. And there's two big things sort of driving that inconsistency, and that is security concerns and economic concerns. You want to have a set of balanced rules, but every individual country has their own perception of what their security concerns are and what their economic concerns are. And comparing things across the board, and I'm going to irritate a lot of people with this comparison, so I'll do it, just move on. That's the beauty of a webinar. They can't start shouting at me and throwing things at me. Everyone says, well, the proof that US is just a horrible, hypocritical place is we're screaming about Ukraine, but we're not screaming about Israel. Now, you can have a debate about what are the legitimate security concerns, because what both Russia and Israel are arguing is that they're doing what they're doing because of legitimate security concerns. I don't think we should conclude that once you say legitimate security concerns, therefore you get to do whatever you want to do. I also don't think you should be able to say that if you oppose someone's security concerns, they're automatically wrong. It depends on the circumstances. Russia invaded Ukraine. Ukraine did not threaten Russia in any way, shape, manner, or form. Now, however one may feel about what Israel has done, no one can credibly claim that Israel didn't face some very clear threats from Hezbollah, from Iran, from Hamas, from a bunch of different groups that Russia really didn't face. And where does that conclude? I don't know, because you also make some very good points about human rights violations and different things that Israel has done. But the frame of the conversation has to have more flexibility around economic concerns and around security concerns. And whatever international institutions have to have that sort of flexibility, for lack of a better way to put it. So that's one piece of the answer. But the second piece of the answer goes beyond international institutions and what the US should do in a world that we no longer dominate. Number one is, I think, like we have to use diplomacy. We have to figure out how to peacefully coexist. We do also need to have an adequate deterrent. We just can't think of that deterrent as some sort of absolute guarantee. You can have a policy of wanting to deter China and Russia and not have the policy that we seem to have right now, where we somehow have to build a military that could defeat them both at the exact same time. That's not possible, and it's a ridiculous thing to try to rely on. Deterrence, not dominance, is one of the sentences that I would throw out there. The other thing, and this is where we get into a little bit of the critique of Trump, we need partners and allies now more than ever. We can't do it on our own. We can't dominate. So to take Trump's approach to the world, which is basically, screw you, I'm taking whatever I can, and you're just going to have to live with it. We're going to be alienating countries, pushing them away, weakening the alliances and partnerships that we have. And then crucially, the next piece of this, I like to refer to this as the undecided vote. People think of it as the global South or a bunch of different, there's a whole lot of countries out there that aren't invested directly in the US versus Russia, China, North Korea, Iran thing. They're just trying to get by in Latin America and Africa and Asia. We need to figure out how to be helpful to those countries. And it's not helpful to those countries to show up and say, our values are better than theirs. You have to be with us. They don't give a rat's ass about that. A. B. What values? What the hell are you talking about? I'm trying to feed my people. I got this problem with this over here. So we need to work with them on their terms. And Trump's approach to this, and this is, I think, the biggest critique or criticism of Trump, when the US is a player in the world, so we got to interact with all these other players. It's basic politics. I've been doing it my whole life. And whenever I determine that I want something, I want to pass a bill or I want to get something done, and then I see these are the people who I have to get to agree with me. My first question is always, what do they want? So how can we work together? You got something, I got something. Can we get to the same place? Trump's approach is, I want this. You are in a position to give it to me. So I'm going to punch you in the face repeatedly until you give it to me. And then when you do give it to me, I'm going to punch you in the face repeatedly still, just to make sure that you don't ever think about not giving it to me. That's not going to work, because a lot of these countries, the BRICS countries, are a real issue. US economic might is dwindling because other countries are growing up. And the more we alienate them, the whole secondary sanctions thing. If you do business with Iran, we're going to cripple you. And the thinking is, well, that will force them to not do business with Iran. No, it will force them to go find a different partner and move further away from us so that we have less influence with them. So that's how I think we got to do the international institutions from a more realistic place, build partners and allies, deterrence, diplomacy, coexistence with our adversaries, and then work the undecided vote.
I got a question from John Koenig here, which is very important. I'm going to summarize it a little bit, but essentially, when you're talking about the alliances, one of the potentially negative impacts of them, plenty of positives, of course, is that there's created a dependence on the United States, and we're now seeing their essentially lack of options when the United States is pulling in a different direction. Even though all the way back from Barack Obama's time, there's been consistent messaging from the United States. You got to, raise your own spending, get a little bit more of your security shouldered by yourself instead of relying on the U.S. And then Trump comes in and does it in a completely different way. And now they're standing there, and you have Germany talking about potentially looking at a nuclear option, Poland doing so, even Sweden having those conversations. How do you think the United States should, on the one hand, be able to have an alliance, but at the same time be welcoming a degree of strategic autonomy that ensures that there isn't this dependency that causes all kinds of other challenges, both for them, but also from the United States?
That is the $64,000 question. And the first part of it is easy. The second part of it is hard. The first part of it is what we've talked about. The world has changed. The balance that we set up post-World War II made sense and worked just fine, which was heavy dependence on the US from a security standpoint, but also from a financial standpoint. Well, that's changed. As we've discussed, we don't have that level of dominance, that level of power, and other countries have risen up. How do you then rebalance the relationship when you've got all these things that were put in place based on this other set of facts? How do you then sort of move in a slightly different direction without upsetting it? And this is a horrible analogy, but the analogy that is occurring to me is how Lebanon set up their government post-World War II. And, you had Sunni, Shia, Maronite Christian, and I'm forgetting somebody, but anyway, and they were going to balance that out. And that was fine until the populations changed. And then the groups that had the larger population said, hey, we got to change this. I need more power. And the other group said, we're not giving it up. And they fought a bloody 15-year civil war as a result. So it's hard to fix that. But I think rebalancing is an absolute appropriate part of this. It's not bad that President Trump is putting pressure on NATO to step up and provide more for their own security. It's bad if he wants to detonate the entire alliance out of selfishness. And that's going to be, we're renegotiating a contract here. All right. Sorry, I use football analogies. We just parted ways with Geno Smith, as a Seattle Seahawks fan, because it wasn't that we didn't want him. It's just we didn't want him for $45 million a year. So there you are. So we're renegotiating that. And it's going to be different than it was before. And we have to renegotiate in an intelligent way without detonating those alliances. And then you can build up that partner, and then they will become less dependent on us. And that's good for them and good for us. And but
you're in favor of a greater degree of strategic autonomy on their end.
Absolutely. It's good. That would be good for them and good for us, as long as we're not, sadly, my football analogy doesn't work because we can't trade Sweden to anybody. So, it's not the way it works. But the point is, we want to get to the point where that it's a rebalancing of the relationship. It's like any partnership. If you're in a business and this person was taking on that much and getting this much money, and I think being patient about it. And what really worries me is people are so dogmatic and doctrinaire. And one of the things I hope Quincy will talk about and work with on this is you started out asking about, what did we do right? What did we do wrong the last 4 years? We are litigating that so much. The centrists want to argue this side of it. The progressives want to argue that side of it. The neo-lib, they want to prove that they were always, as near as I can tell, there's no group that was always right about anything over the course of the last 30 years. There's been mistakes made in different places. We need to get away from, I want to make sure my ideological group wins, and get to a set of policies that actually fit the moment that we are in right now, which is so radically different than any moment we've been in before.
Another hot button foreign policy, of course, is China, and you already alluded to it a little bit. Huge concerns exist over Taiwan as a flashpoint in our relationship, and preparation for military confrontation with China has been a major focus of your committee's work. At the same time, unlike some of the other countries that you have mentioned, China has not taken part in a major foreign military intervention for some decades now. And because it is so deeply invested in the global economy, it shares in many ways a strong interest with the United States in having a degree of stable global system. It also offers a lot of significant resources for development, etc. So there is, but we don't see that these competing priorities, competition and cooperation with China, treated equally in Congress. During the last China Week in Congress, there were almost 30 bills focused on competition, and not a single one expanding educational exchange or working on climate transitions together, shared threats that we absolutely have a common interest on. With this in mind, we have a question actually from one of your constituents, Jim Young of the Washington State China Relations Council. Given the growing tensions between the US and China, how should we balance national security concerns with maintaining economic engagement, especially for states like Washington that have a very strong trade relationship with China?
Yeah, I have a simple, pithy answer up front and then something more complicated. Everyone wants to talk about what their plan is to beat China. Anytime anyone says that, you got to ask the question, what is your plan to peacefully coexist with China? We are completely ignoring even trying to figure out how to make that work and constantly focusing how to beat them, whether it's to win the war game that we've set up so that we can be in a position to win a war with China, or whether it's how we can crush them economically. I mean, that's all the focus. And look, part of the focus, as I've said, that is appropriate. We need to be able to have an adequate deterrence, and we need to be able to compete economically. But if we're not even asking the question, and I think you framed it fairly well, maybe we could work together on, global health issues, or on global warming, on energy needs that we have. I hate the phrase climate change because it doesn't mean anything to anybody. I mean, climate change to most people means it was raining yesterday, it's sunny today. We got to come up with a little bit more forceful language for the threat that global warming and our energy crisis poses to the planet. But that's a side note. So number one is ask that question. Force people to say, what's your plan to get along with China? Because as I said, we're not going to defeat them. Now, one of the challenges here, yes, China has not engaged in any particular war, but they do have expansionist ambitions. They claim territory in at least a half dozen, if not more, different countries right now. That's a sovereign territory of other countries. So getting them to chill on that front of wanting, part of Indonesia, part of the Philippines. Obviously, we've got the Taiwan issue, which is different. But India, hell, they claim part of Russia for that matter. I wonder how they talk about that issue. If we could get them to integrate as well, and part of it is getting China to tone their rhetoric down. One of the most searing memories, I went to the Shangri-La dialogues back in 2019, and that's where all the defense industries show up in Singapore and have a conversation, Asia powers. And the Chinese defense minister, his entire speech was a broadside attack on the United States of America. It was brutal. And it was like a sixth grade bully just telling you it. And I was like, yeah, you got to work with us a little bit here. So, but I think we need to have that plan and have that conversation, like I said.
Another hot button issue is, and this is of course something that you would know quite a lot about, is that in February, the House moved forward on a budget resolution that will allow them to significantly cut spending if they choose through a process called reconciliation. The proposal that passed the House and is now in the hands of the Senate would cut billions of dollars from agricultural, labor department, energy and commerce, and other places. And your committee would get instructions to increase spending 100 billion if it passes, which would be on the Pentagon. This process puts us in this situation where, because Republicans want this bill to decrease federal spending overall, any increase in Pentagon's budget have direct trade-offs on domestic spending. Our researchers at the Quincy Institute have put out many pieces on waste, fraud, and abuse happening at the Pentagon. So we're quite disappointed, to say the least, to see that the Pentagon has not been subjected to the same spending standard cuts and efficiency requirement that other agencies. And wanted to hear your view about this and whether you think actually that defense spending increases if they come at the expense of domestic spending, what that will actually do to U.S. national security.
Once again, you have asked a multi-layered question. And the first most important part of this is our fiscal approach is absurd as a country right now. And it's not just Congress, it's the American people. Our fiscal approach for 30 years, not 30 years, 25 years now, 24 years thereabouts, has been, let's be in favor of a balanced budget, against any tax increase, and in favor of massive spending increases. That's our fiscal policy. So every year, if you're a member of Congress and you do a poll in your district, you will see that the public clearly wants the budget balanced, their taxes cut, and their spending increased, broadly speaking. The math simply doesn't add up. And because of that math, all kinds of illogical things happen. So that's point number one. Point number two, government efficiency, I don't even know what abuse means, by the way. But anyway, the waste, fraud, and abuse line has become not something that people use because they want greater efficiency and effectiveness in something. It's become the line they've used because there's something that they want to cut. And it shouldn't be that. We should be focused on better government efficiency and effectiveness, going after waste and fraud in all institutions. Now, I will tell you, the Pentagon, in my experience, doesn't have any more waste and fraud in it than most other programs. Certainly, Medicare and Medicaid have a lot of people trying to rip us off, even as they're really, really, really important programs. Don't misunderstand me. So when people come in and say, we're going after waste, fraud, and abuse, that means that that's their chosen answer to duck the math problem of trying to balance the budget while cutting taxes and raising spending. So all of that is a frame that wraps around this, whether you're in favor of more defense spending or less defense spending, in favor of cutting entitlements or not in favor of cutting entitlements. That frame makes it all very confusing. All of that said, the one biggest thing that I feel, we can't keep cutting taxes by trillions of dollars. We've done it over and over and over again. And that's the biggest flaw, to my mind, in the Republican budget plan. They claim that we have to do these ridiculous draconian cuts in Medicaid, which I'm 100% against, by the way. And all these programs we're seeing, they're firing people, they're shutting down grant programs, violating the law, in some cases violating the Constitution. And they all come back and say, we have to do it because fiscal responsibility. But their budget adds trillions of dollars to the deficit to pay for these tax cuts. So number one, let's get rid of the tax cuts. That's the best thing we can do to protect Medicaid. Number two, let's really get after waste and fraud and inefficiencies in government. Randomly firing a bunch of people and randomly cutting off grant programs isn't going to do it. I have all manner of ideas for how to get after Pentagon waste. Their requirements process is a nightmare. It's all process, no results. And there are ways to do that. And I think we ought to do that. Now, against all of that backdrop, to your specific question, no, I do not think that we should radically cut Medicaid and increase the defense budget by $100 billion. I don't. It's like $25 billion a year. It's really not that much. So I'm not in favor of doing that. I think it's a problem. But the last thing I will point out, and I know Don Smith is likely listening to this. That's an inside joke about a constituent that I talk to a lot. So he'll probably lose his damn mind when I say what I'm about to say. But as a percentage of GDP, the department, we spend less on defense now than we have at any time since the end of World War II. What has massively increased since the end of World War II is spending on domestic social programs, which I'm all in favor of. I don't have a problem with it. I mean, Medicaid didn't exist. Medicare has been expanded. We've expanded all manner of different domestic spending programs over the course of that year, while defense, as a percentage of GDP, has actually gone down. It's funny, where Trump said, we want Europe to spend 4% of their GDP on defense. We're not spending 4% of our GDP on defense. And I'm not advocating that we should, but the argument that, oh my gosh, the reason we have this massive debt and deficit problem is because of all the money we're spending on defense is not true. Now, you may still want to cut the defense budget, and there are arguments for doing that, and it's part of the overall solution, but I just want to be accurate about it. So it's going to be a big mess as we try to fight through all of those contradictions.
But if we shift towards a grand strategy in which we're not trying to dominate every corner of the world, and we don't believe that we should be dominating China, and we don't believe that we can fix every problem. That should arguably open up quite a lot of openings to be able to make the Pentagon far more efficient.
No, well, actually, that doesn't open up a single opening to make the Pentagon more efficient. It does create openings where we don't have to spend as much money as we thought we had to spend. There are other things that need to be done to make it more efficient. Whether you're spending $1 trillion or $500 billion, you can spend it more efficiently or less efficiently, and we need to get more intelligent about how we do that without a shadow of a doubt. But yes, I think, and part of the problem in the Pentagon budget right now, and I know we're at time and I have to run, but is because we have all of these plans. Oh my gosh, China has more ships than we do. We got to build 500 ships. We got to build the F-35. We got to build. It's like, we can't possibly build everything that they say we need to build in order to meet that level of dominance that everybody says we have. So, and I'm an excessively practical person, and I always believe that every problem has a solution. You play the cards you're dealt, you look at it realistically, and you get to a decent place. But right now, and I'll end on a note that I think your audience will appreciate. Right now, our obsession with having to have a military that can dominate anybody, anytime, multiple people at the same time, it's impossible to achieve. We can't possibly build that. And it's leading us to make all manner of bad policy decisions. So let's step back and say, okay, we can't do that. Well, what can we do? Are we really just all dead because of that? No, we can build a world where we work on partnerships and alliances, where we don't dominate, we deter, we rely on diplomacy, we rely on relationships, we work with the other countries of the world to meet our legitimate needs and to try and meet their legitimate needs. We can choose a different future. And there's a reason I really like talking with your group. I don't agree with you on everything, as we well know, but we've got to build that different future, because the future of dominance, that's not an option. It's not on the menu. All right. It's not there. I don't think it would be desirable, even if it was, for a whole bunch of different reasons, but we don't have to get into that discussion because the restaurant is not offering that anymore. We're going to have to choose something else.
I think that's a fantastic point to end this conversation with. And I think it's a message that would resonate not only with the American people on both sides of the aisle, but also a lot of other members of Congress on the left and on the right. Congressman, thank you so much for this conversation. Really appreciate it. We hope that this is just the beginning of a longer engagement. And we indeed are extremely eager to see many of the ideas that you have put forward in this conversation be spread and be picked up by others in Congress and elsewhere as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Trita. I appreciate the opportunity.
Likewise. To all of you who have watched this, thank you so much for joining us. We have another webinar that will take place on the 14th of March that I wanted to quickly plug, which is the PKK's Future, Real Dissolution or Strategic Shift, featuring Gunul Tol of the Middle East Institute and Barku Ozlik from RUSI. QI's Adam Weinstein will moderate. If you haven't signed up for our mailing list, please go to www.quincyinst.org. Sign up so that you can get all the invitations to our webinars and events, as well as our briefs, papers, reports, and other products. Thank you so much for joining us today.